Namaste. To say that a lot has transpired in Afghanistan in the last week or so would be a gross understatement. The events that have happened have been interpreted in a multitude of ways by the so-called Indian intelligentsia. And so today's clear-cut episode is to clear the clutter around what has transpired and how we interpret it, and how the events of Afghanistan affect Bharat. So before we get to Afghanistan, but something interesting has happened in the Calcutta High Court today, right? And that is in the judgment in the case related to the post-poll violence in West Bengal.
Right.
So tell us what has happened and what the judgment is about.
So, I think in a batch of petitions, about 6 or 7 petitions, several petitioners had approached the Calcutta High Court asking for the intervention of the judiciary so that a central investigation team could be constituted at the very least to investigate into the post-poll violence that erupted at the very least from the 2nd of May after the announcement of election results post the election set in West Bengal. And initially most of these petitions were before the division bench of the Calcutta High Court, and subsequently a decision was taken by the Chief Justice that perhaps this matter warrants the constitution of a constitution bench, a 5-member bench, so to speak, headed by the Chief Justice of the Calcutta High Court itself. So all these petitions were ultimately transferred before the constitution bench of the Calcutta High Court, which seized of these matters. And after several hearings, on the 3rd of August, the judgment was reserved. Arguments concluded and judgment was reserved. And today we have a 124-page judgment which effectively vindicates the position taken by each of the petitioners. In my case, I appeared as the arguing counsel specifically for an organization and an individual who was representing refugees who had fled Bengal to Assam as a consequence of the post-poll violence, where there was a very clear specific demographic identity associated with the people who fled, as well as I think perhaps the attackers. And we also represented a few gang rape victims, so to speak, who had approached us asking for representation in court because they had lost complete faith in the system. There were other petitioners as well who represented victims of murder, rapes and other things as well. So today we have a judgment where the court has effectively come to the very clear conclusion that the state machinery turned a blind eye to the mayhem that was initiated and triggered, perhaps in a premeditated fashion. And that seems to be the very clear finding that has come, and it's a concurring judgment. That is, there's not a single opinion that is dissenting, so to speak. There may be a couple of disagreements on certain aspects as to how high this goes, but by and large I think they are very clear that the machinery as a whole in the state of West Bengal, for which the state government of West Bengal must take responsibility, must be held responsible for the utter lack of let's say rule of law, the lawlessness that effectively resulted in mass exodus, thousands of gang rapes, at the very least hundreds of gang rapes concentrated in certain very specific districts. And it will be interesting to understand why those gang rapes happened in some of those districts, what are the causal factors there, coupled with denial of public distribution system such as ration, rice and whatnot. And some of them who had fled, and when they wanted to come back, they were asked to pay anywhere between 25,000 to 2,50,000 in terms of jizya, effectively. So all of this has happened, and the Supreme Court, the Calcutta High Court has recognized all of this. A 3-member SIT has been constituted to investigate into these issues. Apart from that, matters relating to rapes as well as murders have been specifically transferred to a central team, and a retired Supreme Court judge would monitor the investigation of the SIT. And I think there are even directions with respect to payment of compensation to victims through a direct transfer mechanism, so on and so forth. But the fact that there is a violation of the rule of law and the constitutional obligation of the state machinery, for which the state government wanted the election commission to be held responsible, by the way, okay, saying that if it's a post-poll violence, then the election commission must take responsibility. When it's post-poll violence, in which case it's the state government must take responsibility.
Right.
And they went about issuing, let's say, threats and diktats to a lot of people on social media, including journalists, asking them to not speak about gang rapes because apparently nothing had happened. The zero loss theory, which was propounded with respect to the 2G and 3G scam, was sought to be propounded here, saying that there was zero loss of life. And if at all there was a loss of life, that was in the usual course of business and not connected to the post-poll violence, so to speak. So I think each of these canards have been concretely demolished by a 5-member bench of the Calcutta High Court. I'm 100% sure that the West Bengal government will appeal against this and approach the Supreme Court. But I think when such a serious issue has been taken cognizance of by the Constitutional Court and 5 judges of the High Court of that particular state have come to a conclusion, notwithstanding the prevalent atmosphere and mahal of dar and fear in West Bengal, I think it speaks volumes.
Right. So I was just thinking about the parallels between Afghanistan and West Bengal.
Right.
And to me it seemed like West Bengal was the inverse situation of what is transpiring in Afghanistan.
Right.
Because if you just look at the outrage that is happening in the media about the takeover by Taliban.
Right.
The fact remains that they have widespread popular support.
Correct.
Which is what enabled them to capture one city after the next as soon as the troops withdrew. And now, barring a few stray incidents which is publicized hugely in the media,
right.
Where they're hanging by the the aircraft wheels and stuff like that. But the situation there, I mean, it's paradoxical in a sense, because you have a widespread support for a undemocratic regime.
Correct.
So you have democratic support for an undemocratic regime, while in Bengal you had a democratic exercise leading to all sorts of undemocratic steps by the state, right?
Correct.
So now, how do you view that, especially in the light of your new book and the ideas that are discussed there? How legitimate is the Taliban government, and does it necessarily have to draw authority from, let's say, the nod of the West, the white man, to be able to rule that place?
See, we'll have to put ourselves perhaps in the shoes of 2 different dramatis personae. As an Indian, what is my reaction? And as, let's say, a Hindu, what is my reaction? And both of these are an inward perspective. And the other is, what would I think had I been an average non-Hindu, non-Christian, non-Sikh, non-Buddhist Afghan? Okay. As an Indian, I clearly see dark clouds looming, 100%. What is most troubling is that, as opposed to the sheer vitriol that was heaped upon Taliban in 1996, and rightly so, today there seems to be a greater degree of legitimacy and acceptance coming from the usual suspects, which tells me that the situation has only become worse because there's a clear degree of normalization of let's say acceptance to radical Islam, so to speak. Whether someone wants to attach this prefix or not, I leave it to them. But according to me, there is a clear Islamist agenda which this particular organization stands for, and that seems to have a significant degree of support both among civil society members and media members in Bharat. Okay, so that is extremely troubling. And because I'm even told that certain student organizations celebrated the takeover of Taliban. Student organizations in Bharat celebrated the takeover of Afghanistan by Taliban. I think then we'll have to wake up. Something is up. Okay. And in addition to, of course, I'm not a security expert and I don't want to hold forth on it. As someone who certainly has a serious interest, if not aptitude for, and that's for people to decide in terms of civilizational studies, I do believe that this is not something that is a matter of happenstance. It's something doesn't happen like this overnight. When 3 lakh soldiers drop their posts, completely abandon everything and allow their country to be taken over by 75 to 80,000 ragtag militia, let's not call them ragtag militia, let's give them the respect of the fact that they are committed, they know what exactly they want, and they've been at it for 20 years now. Okay, so let's call it the most organized terrorist organization in the world. Okay, something that was previously held by the LTT, then it went to Al-Qaeda, then ISIS, now it's come to Taliban, that position. So this particular organization has managed to tweak its nose at the so-called superpower, okay, and proving effectively that ideology will always trump technology, okay, and commitment and conviction will always trump any kind of vague notions of setting up democracy and all that. Okay, that has been an utter failure, I'm surprised that they didn't learn the lesson in Vietnam, they didn't learn the lessons in other places. They lost heavily in Iraq, and they continued to believe that they'd somehow succeed in Afghanistan. I don't know what kind of people run the security apparatus there or strategic apparatus there. It's a country which abounds in strategic institutions like the AEI, this and that, and this is what they've been able to come out with. We'll have case studies which will actually tell us what went wrong, but I don't think they'll ever get it right. Okay, so one, there is a problem there. But if, let's say, taking this discussion forward, clearly a lot of backroom channel discussions have happened where this transition has been given the impression that perhaps it's violent and rapid and all that, but maybe it has worked out best for all the dramatis personae of the stakeholders involved, where one stakeholder wants to get out as soon as possible because he has anyway promised withdrawal of troops to his constituency in America. And clearly the weakest link in this entire chain is the Afghan establishment, the so-called legitimate Afghan establishment and the army. So that was the most dispensable thing. And they have been openly welcomed and cozily welcomed by the UAE, with all the money now being transferred and all of that. The soldiers vanish overnight. These people take over. And you have English-speaking Taliban spokesperson holding press conferences, which is supposed to be a Nobel Peace Prize worthy achievement, right? And each of these people are now telling us about what is human rights and so on and so forth. So, one, I don't think we should simply buy into this theory of this being, let's say, abrupt or something that has happened overnight. But had I been a Muslim Afghan, perhaps this couldn't have been possible without the average support of the members of the society. If this is what that society wants, I think the rest of the world should leave them to their own devices. Let them deal with the consequences. If this is how they wish to live, we should leave it to them. Because at the end of the day, you try and poke their nose, you become the outsider, you become the person who interferes with their so-called way of life, if at all it can be called one. All of this happens. And India went about investing billions of dollars in development, trying to create goodwill and all of that. What do you have at the end of the day? You're not a strategic player in Afghanistan. Your investment should have yielded strategic results. It hasn't. So apart from the rest of the world having to rethink its Afghan strategy, I think Bharat needs to seriously think. If you think you can buy goodwill in these parts of the world among such people, it's impossible. And the only country that stands to benefit from this entire chaos is not Pakistan, it's China.
Absolutely. So
to quote, let's say, certain words or let's say certain phrases from The Godfather, it's not Tataglia, it's Bajini. So Pakistan is what I would call is the concubine here it's the all-weather concubine of China, which has effectively played the role of the front. But I don't think Pakistan is going to be able to build a strategic depth here. It's going to be China that's going to be able to build a strategic depth here because they have energy interests and whatnot. In any case, the presence of a Taliban establishment is a serious, let's say, hotspot, or it's trouble for Bharat. So China has 100% incentive to continue investing in keeping that particular establishment alive, no matter who does what. So I would certainly think that the Chinese hand, if not obvious, is at the very least fairly plausible.
Right. So this reminds me of a quote by Thomas Sowell, and I'll just read it out. If we learn nothing else from the tragedy of the war in Afghanistan, it should be that we should put an end forever to the self-indulgence of thinking that we can engage in nation building and creating democracy in countries where nothing resembling democracy has ever existed.
Right.
He said that in 2014.
Right.
And whatever you just said kind of resonates with this, and also points to the failure of this Western liberal democracy, the model that we have,
right.
Tried to sort of universalize and idealize in Bharat as well. And what it simply points to is the conceptual limits of this model,
right.
and the fact that okay, it may work for some, but it doesn't work for others, and which brings us back to the distinction between territorial and civilizational nationalism again.
Right.
And what does that mean for India, right? If we continue to look at Afghanistan from a territorially nationalist lens,
right.
then nothing will make sense, and
right.
we'll continue to spin these stories. But I think we should recognize that whatever they have chosen, whatever way of organizing their society they have chosen, it is their wish. And if that implies that it is a danger to us, then we need to prepare accordingly.
Right, right.
But in the other model which we have currently, which is the territorial nationalism,
right.
we have no equipment, we have no tools to deal with this situation, because we are doing the same thing in Afghanistan that we've been doing in my state, in Kashmir.
Right.
We've been pumping money, hoping that we will win them over.
Right.
But that's not going to happen.
Right.
So, coming specifically to the dangers
Right.
of what this could bring to India, what do you think?
So, I'll address the conceptual or the theoretical aspect of the issue that you have touched upon, and something that I have hinted at and perhaps even developed at in the book, which is that it is not my case that anything and everything can be passed under the rubric of moral relativism, so to speak. That's not my position at all. I do believe that there are certain objective aspects of human conduct and behavior which can be decided in fairly clear position. You can take clear positions. However, the issue that I have been trying to address, and which has been mistaken for moral relativism, is that any discussion on morals, any discussion on principles cannot be a top-down discussion, and certainly cannot be a Eurocentric discussion or a Western normative discussion. Okay? If on the question of formulation of principles and values and normals, or let's say norms, so to speak, if I as a culture and a society have not been given a seat at the table to participate in the formulation of those universal principles, then clearly I am merely a passive participant, a mere recipient of those morals. That has been my primary position, because I am not going to sit here and justify every barbaric practice as far as Afghanistan is concerned, from bachabazi to whatever they do. I am not going to sit and justify that. I'm not going to say it seems to work well for their culture, let them continue doing it. The point is, I have the right to disagree, I have the right to take a position, but do I have the right to invade Afghanistan and then impose my values on that? That's a question I don't know. I don't have an answer to. Okay, going by that logic, how different would we be from the democracy building exercise that the US has tried to, let's say, expand all over the world and faltered and failed and sputtered and stammered, I mean, humongously. Okay, so ultimately it's for each society to walk at a certain pace and realize what's good for it and what's bad for it, and realize that maybe certain practices are outdated. I'm not saying therefore turn a blind eye to external influences. External influence is very different from imposition from the outside or by an outsider. That's the clear position that I've taken. Okay, and I would apply this to even any of our practices. Assume for a moment, and I dare say this, assume for a moment that certain practices relating to untouchability, had it continued even in 2021, okay, I would certainly have issues with it. Notwithstanding my disagreement with the history of caste as it is projected today, as a matter of principle, I would have a problem with that particular practice itself. Okay, whatever reasons may have existed in the past, I am not aware of it, but today it has certainly no reason to exist, and it should not exist. That's the very clear position that I am taking. Okay, so unfortunately, a call for and a case for subjectivity is being conflated with and confused with, perhaps deliberately so, with moral relativism. Subjectivity is not the same as moral relativism. There is a clear line to be drawn between the two. Unfortunately, I don't think some people are getting it. Anyways, now as far as the problems, let's say, which Taliban poses to Bharat, one, your state, Kashmir, part of my sacred land, our sacred land, will certainly see more action, is my belief. Unless Taliban chooses to understand that thanks to 370, thanks to, let's say, the surgical strikes that this particular government has undertaken in the past, that it's not dealing with the same old dispensation or the same old psyche which used to plague India, that this is Bharat. Okay, so I'm hoping that there is a certain realization, because is it possible for us to entertain this possibility? Let me answer this question. ISIS never dares to attack Israel. Even if, let's say, a friendly bullet is fired in the direction, they immediately clarify that it is not our intention to attack Israel. ISIS has never done that, remember that. For an entity which is supposed to be established in the name of Islam and for its avowed hatred of Jews and whatnot, it has not done so because they know that the retaliation will be bloody and ruthless. Okay, that kind of a message seems to work. Therefore, as long as India takes a similar position with respect to the Taliban, saying, do what you want to, but if you affect Indian interests or if you affect Indic minorities or communities, there will be hell to pay, and we will tighten the screws in whatever way we can. As long as that message is sent, I think that will be fantastic. But the other issue, this is the hard problem, or let's say this is the hard aspect of the issue. The softer aspect is the stupid clamor, dare I say squeamish, yellow-bellied, downright stupid clamor for, let's say, giving or extending asylum and refugee status to everyone coming from Afghanistan. No, absolutely not. There are very clear responsibilities that Bharat has towards, let's say, the non-Muslim minorities, specifically Hindu, Buddhist, Jain, if at all they are still alive, 500 families, 600 families, that's what you're looking at. Everybody else will have to go through a security filter, 100%. Simply because this regime in Afghanistan, not an administration, this regime in Afghanistan has certainly come with a significant groundswell of support. Therefore, we don't know how many members of the Afghan society have themselves been radicalized and Talibanized, so to speak. And I don't wish to apply that filter to the Sikh communities or Hindu communities for obvious reasons, because they are supposed to be dhimmis in that particular state or zimmis in that particular state, so I can't accuse them of radicalization, right? So given that, I'm entitled to constitutionally and legally and strategically strike these distinctions. So in fact, I put out a recent thread where I had specifically said on Twitter that the government must extend all humanitarian aid and material aid to support everyone there. But when it chooses to extend the facility of asylum or refuge, it must be clear as to what its priorities are, civilizational priorities and strategic interests. These are the only two pillars.
Absolutely, absolutely. No, but I mean, the distinction that you drew between moral relativism and subjectivism,
Right.
That's a point well taken. But I think that there is a case to be made for dharmic expansionism as well,
Okay.
right? What has happened in Afghanistan poses a direct threat
Right.
to us civilizationally, to physically actually,
Right.
and it goes without saying that were India not the kind of soft state that it is, it would make sense for us to set things right the way America has done. जो सात समंदर पार से उन्होंने यहाँ पे किया,
Correct.
that was just to secure their own interests, at least overtly so, whatever may have been the covert reasons. So if you look at the Indian state as a civilizational entity, then it also goes without saying that expanding your domain of authority is one of the duties of the state.
Right.
That's how it has always been. That's what the Chakravarti Samrats have been.
Kshatriya, this is the job of a Kshatriya.
Absolutely. And in terms of competing worldviews and competing interests,
Right.
What the West does is that it mixes their commitment to business,
Right.
the global capitalist
Correct.
economy, and then it covers it, sugarcoats it with these moral ideas.
Human rights.
And so basically it's a farce to begin with.
Right.
What the Indians and a large section of the so-called Indian right wing does is that it internalizes that discourse and it thinks that those are actually universal values, without paying attention to their own civilizational knowledge and the worldview that
Right.
we have inherited.
Right.
Because there's a fundamental, like you mentioned, the caste system, and we've had
Right.
enough conversations about that. There is this very deep-rooted insecurity and self-loathing that makes us reject whatever has come. And this, I'm speaking about people who profess to be
Right.
Hindus, and it's not the left or the Islamists.
Clear non-left. Yeah.
And these people, it's because of them that you are, I mean, this mindset, not because of them, but it is this mindset which makes you believe that the Western universalist model is the model to go by.
Correct.
And you're basically paralyzed now,
Right.
because you can't act in your interest, because the Western interest is not your interest. Like you said,
Right.
it's a Eurocentric view.
Correct.
And because you're not interested in or inclined to explore your own moral universe and implement that, therefore you're in a situation where you don't know what to do.
Right. So here there are two levels of answers. So let me address the question of dharmic expansionism in the first place, and then I'll come to this. Ideally, at this point in 2021, I would have expected Bharat to be in a position to think of dharmic expansionism, at least from the standpoint of creating buffer zones which protect your core areas. At the very least, making sure that you have strategic influence in your immediate neighborhood. Vishwaguru, superpower, वो सब बात की बात है. At the very least, ये तो कर लेते हैं. Okay. I am not blaming the current dispensation for it, because it's something that they have inherited as a legacy from the previous dispensation for close to 65-70 years. And maybe we will reach there, hopefully we'll reach there. And I do believe that if this dispensation gets its act right on the civilization front, and if its priorities are clear, I think it has what it takes to do that. Because there is a go-getter attitude that this particular dispensation has, which I think is why people still continue to put faith in it. Okay, there is a reason why that mandate has been given. Be that as it may, unfortunately, I believe that somewhere again we muddle it up when it comes to civilizational issues because of lack of clarity. And this is where this colonial consciousness is very, very important, simply because you're unable to rid yourself of this faith in this universalist validity or universal validity of the Western model. From development to secularism to whatnot, you're not able to rid yourself of it. Okay, and at this stage, the reason why I didn't even bring up the question of dharmic expansionism is, अरे भाई आप पहले अपने घर को तो ठीक कर लीजिए, उसके बाद आप दुनिया की बात करेंगे. बंगाल में लोग मर रहे हैं, Kashmir mein hame, as usual, I don't think, I'm sure 370 has made a lot of difference, but has it improved the situation to such an extent where Kashmiri Hindus can confidently go back and stay? I don't think that has happened yet. Okay, Kerala is going in a slightly different direction. Again, there's a demographic issue. Northeast, which most people don't want to talk about, at least in certain places, thanks to, let's say, the Naga insurgency, so to speak, there are certain parallel establishments going on there. In Punjab, you're seeing active missionary work there. With all this happening, there is no question of us projecting something outside when the projection within itself is so problematic at this stage because of certain filters in our own head and our inability to create a response mechanism, be it from the state side or the society side. That's one. Second, in terms of this relativism, the point that you mentioned about the problem with certain members of the non-left, I don't wish to go after any individual for the simple reason that it's an ideology or it's a position that I have a problem with. It's a mindset. It's a mindset that I have a problem with. Because you see, I think they have bought into the development model of the West. And since they may or may not have sacrificed greener pastures abroad, they want those greener pastures to be established here. Okay, perhaps at the expense of civilizational values. I would completely say, please, I'm all for development. I can't say I'm not for development because I come from a low middle class family and I've had to climb the social ladder. So I'm not the one who's going to say that money doesn't make a difference. Of course it makes a difference. I'm not going to say money before culture, culture before money. I'm saying don't operate in these binaries because it's possible for us to strike a balance between the two.
It's not a zero-sum
game. You don't have to give up one for the other has been the only submission. Imagine me talking about civilization to someone who's struggling to get 2 square meals. I mean, that's downright insensitive. Unfortunately, that is they reduce our position to that, which is not the case in fact. What you're basically saying is, do not divorce your developmental discourse from your civilizational discourse because one affects the other. The way you treat certain punya kshetras, the way you treat nature, each of these aspects are connected. I am not some Luddite who is basically saying, let's all go hug trees and give up every other facility. Is it possible to strike a balance between the two? Can we for a moment, just for a moment, stop looking to the West and up to the West for all sorts of inspiration of these aspects and see what our people have said? But unfortunately, when it comes to this, we go down the path of saying that modernity, modernity, modernity. Arey bhai, modernity ka literature padha hai ki nahi aapne? You have not read it. You have not read it. You don't understand the distinction between postmodernism, postcolonialism and decoloniality. You conflate everything and you put it under one basket. That's a straight giveaway that you have not read anything, notwithstanding your professions of being whatever, let's say intellectual or whatever it is. You have not done your reading. At the very least, go through that literature and have an honest discussion. But this entire discussion is muddled by the fact that this particular segment operates under the belief that we all want the pristine past where the caste system comes back in all its glory. That seems to be the impression that they operate under. No, that's not the point. You anyway have to move forward, and decoloniality is not about going back and living in the past. It's about reinscribing indigenous thought on the present so that our future is less colonial, which is to say, to the extent possible, draw from your own sources. If you call it Swatantra, therefore draw from your own sources as much as possible. And when it comes to legal innovations or societal innovations or development-based innovations or cultural innovations, do not assume that this is an ossified structure. It has a fairly immutable core, but it is also, let's say, put together in a relatively open architecture. Operate within the tradition, and the tradition has its own ways of reform and moving forward. That's the limited submission. Unfortunately, I think this entire argument is lost in this particular segment because their entire thing is driven by caste. If I may say so, their prejudices with respect to the caste discourse is perhaps the reason why they also say what they say with respect to development and other issues. They're not able to get over it at all. They have not been able to open their mind one bit to actually understand this is not the binary to be operated within, because the moment you operate in a binary, you have accepted a Western way of looking at things. This is not a binary. And once we say it's not a binary, oh, therefore it's moral relativism. Arey bhai, subjectivity or moral relativism mein thoda to antar karna seekho. This is something that they have not been able to wrap their heads around. And every time that this conversation happens, it seems like there is a deliberate attempt to draw clear battle lines. It's impossible to even reach out and have a meaningful engagement to say, I'm sure there's a possibility of a middle ground. I'm sure there's a lot more ideation possible, staying within the boundaries of this. Nobody is saying reject the West entirely, for that matter. In fact, in the book I've clearly said, it's not possible for us to turn the clock back and go back. You are looking at a hybrid present and a hybrid future. The only thing is, in the hybrid future, I'm hoping more for an Indic quotient than the Western quotient. That's the kind of hybrid future that I'm talking about, as much as possible. It starts from language to history and every other thing. So, one, in terms of expansionism, let's get our act together within and then speak of projection outside. On the aspect of, let's say, development and everything else and importing all this from outside, the West is beginning to understand the chinks in its own armor, in its own philosophy. So why are you being such a mental slave that you're not even able to acknowledge that the West is saying that there are problems with its model? They have accepted it. There is a regurgitation, let's say there's a cogitation going on there. You might, since you're the slave of the West, then follow at least that.
True. True. No, I mean, I think it's a very simple point, to be honest. It's not about imbibing this thought or that, right, but just about thinking freely, right? And what does free thinking really mean? It means interpreting the reality as per your own experience, as per your lived reality, right? So that itself is empowerment. That in some sense is decolonization, because under the colonial spell you're indoctrinated, you're taught to think in a certain way, and this is just basically freeing yourself from those shackles. It does not really mean that you have to take one label for another, right? So I don't know what's so complicated about that, but be that as it may. So you mentioned the need for filtering out certain demographic groups, and I think that kind of brings back the discussion we had on around the CAA.
Correct.
And I do believe that this is a validation of our stand.
Absolutely.
Right? And what has happened and the dangers that we face today. But I am slightly disappointed with how things have moved since the last time we discussed CAA. In that the CAA has not even been implemented. And even if it were implemented, it wouldn't have helped the people of Afghanistan today. I mean, the Hindus and Sikhs and Christians of Afghanistan, because it had a cut-off date in the first place, right? But at least it would have been a message. But that has also not happened. On the other hand, while this dispensation is certainly different from the earlier dispensations, but what they've done is that, following the lead of their predecessors, they've also gone out of the way and said that, okay, we will process fast-tracked e-visas for the people in Afghanistan, disregarding the dangers that it brings. And I'm saying that even if that is just for
optics,
even then it's a dangerous signal to send. But no such courtesy has been extended to, let's say, the Hindus of Bangladesh. The last time, I remember when the Prime Minister was in Bangladesh, there was
temples
a backlash.
Were being demolished.
Temples were being demolished. Not a single statement from him, right? But forget about that. But on an active basis, we hear what is going on in Bangladesh. Why such no courtesy is being extended to them? I simply don't understand.
That's slightly mysterious even to me, because I do believe, and I genuinely believe, that this dispensation certainly puts lesser stock in the policy of appeasement compared to the previous dispensation. Otherwise, I don't think it would have been able to go ahead with a 370 or with a CAA. So there is a clear position that they have taken on such major issues. There is perhaps an unfortunate accommodation of the radical sides of Bangladesh under the belief that from leader to leader the position changes. If it's Khaleda Zia, there's a certain position. If it's the other person, then there's a certain position. I'm not sure it makes too much of a difference to the lives of Hindus in Bangladesh, because regardless of who is in power, they regularly get raped, they regularly get butchered, even secular Muslims get butchered. So this is the nature of that particular state, where it has been completely radicalized. And I don't think they labor under any kind of gratitude of the 1971 war, liberation, all of that, because at the end of the day, the East Pakistan mentality continues. So that particular mentality has not been dislodged by 1971 under any circumstances. We may think that they are constantly grateful to us. I don't think that's the case anymore. So perhaps I think there should be some rethink on it, because when Bangladesh was specifically included as part of the CAA, it clearly shows that the government is aware of their condition even in Bangladesh. It's not as if they felt that Bangladesh is better and only Afghanistan and Pakistan are terrible. They felt that the position of Hindus across the board is equally bad in each of these states. So as someone who believes that this government has its heart in the right place on several aspects, it could have actually taken this particular position, and perhaps a message could have been sent. At the very least, I would have hoped that the government had said, we have had a discussion with the Bangladeshi dispensation on this issue, on the question of religious minorities, and we've been given the assurance that such minorities, their places of worship, their property, their dignities will be respected. At the very least, that would have helped. And I do believe that the Prime Minister has that kind of clout and the stature, and I would say the political will to have gotten this done. The fact that it did not happen is something that's honestly, genuinely I find it mysterious. Perhaps it didn't seem like a priority, but while it was happening during his tour, I'm sure someone would have told him that this is happening, right? That's one. Now, coming to the question of the CAA, the non-actualization of that is a bit of an issue, because it renders a hard won, or let's say a hard fought for political initiative into let's say a symbolism, or let's say some kind of tokenism. If your own action doesn't reflect the fact that you've walked the talk, you end up giving ammunition to the other side, saying, I mean, all these riots and protests and everything that you've effectively you've weathered it. You have not changed your position either on CAA or farm protests or 370, notwithstanding the protests. And kudos to you for actually doing that. That's fantastic. So why don't you actually go the last mile, implement it, and also see what is it that you can do with respect to the cutoff date, and are there any emergency procedures and provisions that you can actually come out with to deal with the Hindus and Sikhs and their plight in Afghanistan today. That is something that I would expect this particular dispensation to be much more quick about compared to any other dispensation, because they have managed to undertake several evacuation operations in different parts of the world to evacuate Indians. That's something that they've managed to put together in quick notice, on short notice. So I'm sure they can do it. So I don't think it's a question of resources or coordination or whatever it is, but perhaps this intent needs to be expressed even better, and it needs to show in action. That would be my limited submission.
True. I mean, I don't personally, I don't have issues with personalities. I don't have issues with what Mr. Modi believes or does not believe, because I have no access to that information. I look at it purely as the Indian state, right? So there might be different political parties at the helm, but the nature of the beast has not changed to me. It has not changed significantly.
I understand what you're saying.
And when you talk about CAA, for example, to me it looks like the CAA has been kept in a limbo because the state has been held hostage by
the pandemic.
Not just the pandemic, but what happened before that at Shaheen Bagh, for example, right? So I think that's just the surrender of the state to the forces within India, the Breaking India forces. Also, there's this thing about, jaise bola jata hai na ki the Prime Minister works very hard. To me, that's a very vacuous argument. I mean, the Prime Minister, what he does during the day is none of my business, nor do I have access to it again. What he says, on the other hand, is much more important, given that he's the Prime Minister. He's not a lowly employee of some, grade 4 employee somewhere. He's the Prime Minister, and what he says makes all the difference. And I have, personally felt that what he says could be better informed, could be better, thought through before that thing gets said. So that brings me to the fact that this whole business of being a civilizational state that we've been discussing here, it's about what you say, and then that is followed by what you do, because what you say builds the atmosphere, it prepares the ground for action.
Right.
And which is why, I mean, to me, the explanation to why they have behaved in this way with respect to Bangladeshi Hindus, or even with my community, is because they don't say the right things. They don't build the right kind of discourse around things.
Okay.
Perhaps because they don't even know. They're more their time cycle is limited to the 5 years of election and getting back, and that's the nature of liberal democracy itself. So all this needs to change before I think we can start expecting bigger things. What the government says as opposed to what it does. What it does तो बाद में आता है. अभी तो कोई कुछ नहीं करेगा.
Right. So here, I would, when someone tells me that the Prime Minister is perhaps the most hardworking, in fact, Ms. Jayalalitha used to be the same way for Tamil Nadu. Okay, she was known to, and that was her reputation, that she was a workaholic. Okay, and that she would constantly be engaged in doing something for the state. So, at the very least, whether I have access or not, I have no reasons to doubt it, simply because he's someone who doesn't have to feather his family's nest. Okay, and these are certain conscious decisions from what we hear he's taken. As a consequence of which, I do believe that the best way he channels his energy is towards work. And given his reputation as the Chief Minister of Gujarat, and I have no reason to believe that he would have suddenly changed himself once he has occupied this top office. However, having said that, in the last 7 years, the one thing that I have noticed is that apart from several reforms that the government has initiated, like let's say sanitation and whatnot, whatever it has done, quite a few things have happened, including DBTs and whatnot. They have shown their benefits. On the civilizational aspect, I don't think the establishment, so to speak, has been able to, let's say, forge some kind of a long-term vision. Okay, maybe because they're constantly putting out fire, or they're trying to put out the next nonsense that comes from the left of the Congress. However, that is something that every government is expected to deal with as a matter of politics. So the day-to-day ebb and flow shouldn't effectively dilute your long-term vision, if at all you have one. And it is at this stage slightly unclear if there is perhaps a clear vision of the future, because whatever has been done so far is a statement of mission that was expressed in the past previously also. So 370, settlement of rehabilitation of Hindus and Sikhs and all of this. This has been said even in the past. Okay, so I will certainly give credit for the fact that quite a few outstanding issues of the past have been sought to be addressed, and at least they've said the right things on these aspects and moved significantly in the direction. But where do we go from here? There, I'm not sure that there is a clarity. Even if there is clarity within, I don't think that's been messaged enough, and the dissemination of the clarity has not come through. I'm sure there are supremely qualified mandarins sitting in the North Block, the South Block, knowing exactly what they're doing. There's a decent chance that we don't know what we're talking about. I'm willing to concede all of that. And precisely because we don't know what we're talking about under that assumption, and that we don't know what they're thinking, a bit more of messaging could help. But sometimes these conflicting messages come out, and suddenly all the stereotypical allegations that are hurled against the non-left, if those allegations are reinforced by the establishment itself, precisely because it doesn't want to rile up the other side, or it wants to extend an olive branch to the other side, then you end up wondering, you know for a fact that nothing you do is going to appease the other side. The brand or the thappa that they've given you is never going to change. Nothing you do will change. Malini Parthasarathy may come and meet the Prime Minister, but the kind of bile and vitriol that she has for anyone who is a Hindutvadi, or someone who is not from the left, or that entire Hindu establishment, the Hindu establishment, the newspaper establishment has for people who don't share their ideology, is crystal clear. Right from their employees to everybody else, that's how they operate. In fact, even within the family, from what I hear, that's how they operate. There's a clear difference of opinion, and nobody agrees with Mr. N. Ram's position. Very few people actually agree with it, but that's how they operate. So you may want to cultivate, you may want to engage in all of that, but be very, very clear. It's not going to lead to a change of heart or conscience. That's not going to happen. So such being the case, you should continue to do what you have always wanted to do, hopefully, because the one thing that I certainly appreciate as far as the Prime Minister is concerned is that he maintains a dignified silence quite a few times when he is attacked. Sometimes it becomes a double-edged sword when the silence extends to even those aspects when he is expected to speak up.
Say the Palghar sadhus.
Palghar sadhus, I would have expected, assuming as opposed to the sadhus, had a bunch of, let's say, Muslim saints, or let's say, or whatever it is, scholars had been murdered the same way in let's say in public glare, or Christian missionaries had been subject to that, would the establishment and the Prime Minister not have spoken? I'm sure he would have, as he should have, because he holds a constitutional position. He is not the Prime Minister for any particular segment. But why not extend the same courtesy to this particular community as well? Because whether you like it or not, it is this community that is the most bankable section of the population as far as your party is concerned. I don't think any other community you can vouch for with this kind of confidence. So from a political perspective, even if not, let's say, religious or civilizational, whatever it is, there is an incentive to at least engage this particular segment. There, I think more can be done. And the reason why I'm slightly more optimistic is that quite a few things that have happened in Bengal and other places, the feedback I think is being received to say that you have not done what you were supposed to and you could have done more. And ultimately everything seems to come through the route of the judiciary as opposed to the executive and the legislature stepping to the picture, because you have the constitutional mandate as well as the obligation to address and put out these kind of law and order fires when it's so massive, it's so premeditated. So I think that feedback perhaps has gone from several segments of the population and stakeholders. Let's see what comes out of this feedback.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right about the fact that there are much more informed people at the helm of affairs, and they perhaps, I'm sure they know much more than we do sitting here.
Right.
But I don't want to make it about personalities. I'm not really, like I said, I'm not privy to what goes on behind the scenes, what goes on in the mind of the Prime Minister and the Defence Minister and the Home Minister.
Right.
But to me, it is just about pursuing your geopolitical and civilizational interests.
Correct.
And like you very clearly articulated, if you do not have a vision for the future, you end up being confused, or perhaps you just take the moral high ground because it looks good. Right. It's a glorious virtue signaling that you do.
And you react to the moment.
So I think there is a need for that shift, which is what I was referring to in terms of having the right discourse and saying the right things, because that's what changes things. That's what changes mindsets.
Correct.
And unless that happens, I don't think that we are going to go anywhere.
100%. To sum it up, I think if at all it can be reduced to some kind of a flow chart, going back to my engineering days, is that you start with a mission and identify what it translates to. Then you look at it from a strategic perspective, which translates to tactics. Okay. So when people say, no, we lack strategic thinking, strategic thinking towards what?
Absolutely.
What are you moving towards? What is the goal?
Absolutely.
How do you choose to define yourself? What are your terms of engagement with the rest of the world will be decided by what do you want from the rest of the world?
True.
And how do you want to position yourself and project yourself? जब खुद के अंदर आपके अंदर मतलब क्लैरिटी नहीं है, आप क्या प्रोजेक्ट करेंगे? कंफ्यूजन.
Correct.
जो आपके अंदर है आप उसी को तो प्रोजेक्ट करेंगे.
So it's reduced to the tactical level all the time. And every kind of tactic can be rationalized and explained.
You can always justify any tactic as a reaction, or let's say the need because of social compulsions or global compulsions or pressures from here, this and that. But does it help push something central? But if there's nothing central to push in the first place, there's no core objective in the first place, you keep reacting to the moment. This, and dare I say, and I'm more than happy to extend the benefit of doubt to the dispensation and its apparatus to say, given the consolidated majority that you have and the mandate that you have, which is something unprecedented in my living memory, that the same dispensation has got this kind of thumping majority and even better in 2 successive elections, you have what I would call the luxury as well as the freedom of ideating when it comes to the civilizational aspects. Clarify that particular vision. And the best part is, I think there is a fantastic talent pool available with so many people who are subject matter experts, who know what they're talking about on civilizational studies, on economics, on, let's say, on security related issues, people who are supremely qualified, who've got ground experience, who've published, who've been invited to conferences abroad, who have held forth on this particular issue, hoping that at least some dispensation will take a leaf out of their experience and implement it. This dispensation has shown some fantastic initiatives by bringing lateral entries on board when it comes to the bureaucracy. When you're willing to do that, I think more from a civilizational perspective, you should do that even more, because that will be all encompassing and will have a multiplier umbrella effect across the board. Whether you want to build roads in Uttarakhand to be able to meet China's, let's say, problems there, and yet how do you preserve the sanctity of that particular place and the ecology of that particular place? How do you do all of this? This is not possible if the approach is a band-aid approach.
True.
It needs a different kind of a surgery.
True.
And for, let's say, a dispensation that seems to like surgical strikes, I think it should take up an invasive surgery of the establishment and come out with different initiatives. If you don't expect this, or if you believe that a dispensation is not capable of doing this, you wouldn't air that expectation in the first place.
Absolutely.
I believe it's possible that they can do it. I certainly believe that they have the wherewithal for it. Because imagine putting together such a fantastic all-conquering electioneering machine in this country that you've been able to dominate across the board. And even in a state like West Bengal, I don't think it was a failure. 77 seats in literally a war zone is fantastic. And look at the sacrifices that you've been willing to make. In such a situation, I don't think there's a better entity which is placed to look at civilizational issues in a very serious and hard manner.
True.
I hope they start doing it.
True.
And I would say, for good or bad, the takeover of Afghanistan by Taliban has given Bharat a fantastic opportunity to do a serious rethink and take a confident position in the interest of self-preservation.
Absolutely. And in fact, this brings me to the core of the issue. And your book talks about coloniality and the long struggle that we've had with invasions and thought control. So I think the crux of the issue is really that you cannot deal with forces of centuries by thinking in 5-year plans.
Correct.
Which was the original Nehruvian blunder.
Exactly.
So that's the approach, I think, which is required to change, to my limited understanding.
From Panchavarshi, we should move to Pachasvarshi.
Absolutely. That's the minimum that
Correct.
we should do. And with that, I think we've run out of time, but in the next session, I would certainly like to go deep into the ideas of the book.
Sure.
And perhaps also touch upon the happenings in Tamil Nadu with respect to the temple takeover and stuff like that.
Done. Sure.
So thank you again
Thank you
for the time.
Namaste.
And see you soon.
Sure.